Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The program will begin in a few moments. Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Robb, the Senior Director of Research at Common Sense. As you may know, for over 16 years, Common Sense has been helping families navigate the increasingly complex digital world. One of the many ways the organization does that is through our research program, which provides parents, educators, health organizations, and policymakers with reliable, independent data on children's use of media and technology and the impact it has on physical, emotional, social, and intellectual development. I'm excited to welcome you today to this week's Conversations with Common Sense to talk about two of my research colleagues' new book, Parenting for a Digital Future: How Hopes and Fears About Technology Shape Children's Lives. Sonia Livingstone is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. She has published 20 books on media audiences, focusing on kids, media literacy, and rights in the digital environment. In addition to being co-author of Parenting for a Digital Future, Alicia Blum-Ross, a researcher, educator, and advocate who has worked in academia, industry, and civil society to study and create opportunities for children, youth, and families to more safely connect, create, and learn online. I'll talk with Sonia and Alicia for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions via the comments chat. But before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about this wonderful book. Families are living through a time of significant change. So much of life today, parenting in particular, is about negotiating the digital terrain. Our identities, relationships, values, and our children's life chances also seem to revolve around tech. This explains why parents' anxieties and family arguments about technology are so fraught. In Parenting for a Digital Future, the authors draw on extensive and diverse research with a range of parents in the UK to reveal how digital technologies characterize parenting today, as parents determine how to forge new territory with little precedent or support. Broadly speaking, they offer a deeply researched exploration of what it means to parent in a period of significant social and technological change. We should also note that this book was written pre-COVID, so I'll be curious in our conversation today about what the authors expect to change, to be different, or to stay constant in a world that's still wrestling with a pandemic. So to start off, in the book, you talk about parenting, right? A word that seems commonplace, but has actually only been popularized fairly recently. Sometimes parents think of parenting as a series of demanding tasks that they must do in order to be good parents. How's that different than in previous generations? And where should parents do less or more parenting?
Right. Well, thank you for the question, Mike, and for this opportunity to talk about our book, which we're excited about. So I think we began because of this idea that there's just more scrutiny of parents today and such a lot of kind of public commentary about parenting, as if there's a right answer to how parents could parent, and media headlines about parenting fails kind of make this all the worse. So we learned from parents when we interviewed them how much they feel judged and how much they scrutinize each other. But we also tried to kind of stand back and think about the changes that have led to this focus on parenting. Because compared with previous generations, parents are facing rising inequality, reduced welfare, families living across greater geographical differences. And all of this means that they're facing more risk and uncertainty, and they're kind of increasingly on their own in meeting their child's needs. So we kind of came at how parents think so much about digital technology in a way kind of recognizing the wider changes that parents are facing, and also the way in which public policy and society kind of relies on parents, because it's so difficult perhaps to educate people or to have public education about digital literacy, to regulate technology. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of ways in which parenting is, and digital parenting especially, is like really focal. And we found that even though there's more kind of expectation and pressure on parents, they also have fewer places to turn, because compared with their previous generations, they can't so easily turn to their own parents for advice like they might for food or sleep. And they're dealing with technology that is just changing so fast. So, we're kind of really focusing on how they're more responsible, less supported, under more pressure. And as you said in your very nice introduction, somehow technology is focal for all of this. It's like in the frame as the way in which we hope to make things better for our children, and the way we worry that things are getting worse for their children. And that's because we began all our interviews with parents by asking them to look back at their own childhood and then to their children's childhood. And of course, technology is what really makes the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting in the book. I mean, as I was reading it, I was thinking about there just was so much kind of fear about the future, and parents really just kind of wrestling over whether they're making the right choices right now. And I'm sure in previous generations, parents also had to do that under different sets of circumstances. But it was just really striking to me that undercurrent of like, I'm really just struggling with whether I'm handling this right or not, because no one's ever had to deal with this level of digital technology before.
Right, absolutely. And when we ask parents, how do they feel they should be able to control the technology because they've brought it into the home. They've put this great investment in it. And, many of the other parts of their lives are very hard to control, actually. And many of the struggles they're facing, the technology they feel they should be able to control. And it's changing so fast, and it's often opaque and difficult to understand. And it can't bear that kind of expectations that we place on it.
Alicia, in the book, you note 3 styles of digital parenting, right? Practices that parents are engaging in that may be done purposefully or consciously or not, or maybe they're totally coherent kinds of parenting or not. And those 3 styles that you describe are embrace, balance, and resist. Can you describe a little bit about what each of those styles is and when they are useful for parents? And are those styles even contained within the same family at different times?
So I think one of the real pleasures of writing a book that had such a broad spectrum of parents is that we got to spend a lot of time sitting on people's living room floors, having many cups of tea, because this was London, and really getting that big, diverse spectrum of parents. And so within that huge diversity, we interviewed parents who had babies up to 17-year-olds, parents who were living in kind of multi-million-pound homes, and parents who were living in social subsidized housing, 6 family members in a 1-room apartment, etc. And within that huge diversity, we noticed that there was 3 kinds of sort of what we could call genres or kind of constellations of practices that parents often engaged in. So embrace was one, which is where parents really kind of tried to position themselves in some ways as ahead of the curve. They really kind of leaned in to using technology in various kinds of ways, sometimes for educational purposes, sometimes for kind of creative or kind of, family pleasures together, that, whether that was gaming or learning a new skill, like learning to code or playing Minecraft together, or really kind of, investigating different kinds of learning options. And for some of those parents, that was like a kind of a conscious choice to do to kind of get ahead. Probably the majority of parents were engaging in what we could call kind of a practice of balancing. And when we say balancing, that sounds kind of elegant, like a balance beam, sort of gymnastics. But actually, we found that balancing was very effortful. We kind of likened it to sort of standing on a rolling log. So it was a lot of kind of constant calibration. Yes to certain kinds of technology, no to others. How can I kind of decide in the moment? And as Sonia said, with very kind of little precedent, little support. And that was probably the kind of majority of parents. And then we did have some families who were really trying to kind of resist what they felt was the incursion of technology into either their own lives as parents or their children's lives. I think one mother described, her daughter had recently gone to secondary school, and she described the kind of tsunami of devices that were suddenly, in their homes and in their lives. And for some of these parents, resistance was about something had happened. Maybe the child had a difficult experience. One child had been badly bullied, for example, or the parent was, concerned about the child's kind of tech behavior or their own. But in many cases, it was interesting that we found a lot of families that were sort of resisting more because they had a preference for other kinds of activities rather than digital activities. So it was really more of a kind of a value choice and a kind of a philosophy in some ways, rather than necessarily because they'd had a bad experience. And what we noticed is that we don't kind of talk about parents as being embracers or resistors, because actually for some families, they might embrace for one child and resist for another, or they might resist by morning, but embrace by evening. Mm-hmm. And I think one kind of live question for us all right now under the present circumstances is, is resistance futile? Is there a point in trying to resist technology? And I think what we can say is it certainly requires a lot of effort to resist. And so the question is, is that effort well spent given the present circumstances? And I would say that some of those families, obviously we didn't revisit them again during COVID, but you can imagine that some of those stances might have softened somewhat given the present circumstances. And I think, we need to think about whether there's some usefulness in embracing that actually might help all of us feel a little bit less anxious, given the circumstances we're in now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I've been in a lot of conversations recently, as I assume you have, about what the long-term effects of COVID are going to be. And I wonder about this kind of long-term change in like how we just treat and embrace or resist or try to balance technology is going to shift. I think about it all the time in terms of my family. Like you alluded to before, like what's good at breakfast may not be working by dinner time. And sometimes you have to be forgiving with yourself or try to, in some cases I say, I'm going to try to do it a little bit differently tomorrow. But I wonder if in a post-COVID world, we'll get a little bit better at understanding where kind of to slot our fears and maybe hopes about technology in terms of like our kind of broader everyday activities. Do you have any thoughts about, like where you think this might be headed, given the interviews that you did for this book?
I think one thing that we had been advocating for a long time and that COVID has really brought into stark relief is that, the advice that parents were traditionally given, and a lot of parents kind of echoed the traditional American Academy of Pediatrics screen time guidelines, the kind of no screen time under 2 and 2 hours a day above that, which actually have now been revised and are much more nuanced, but that kind of 2 by 2 still sticks in people's minds. And interestingly, these were parents that had come, that were living in London, but had come from Ethiopia and India and the US and the UK. And actually many people kind of parroted that same framing. So for a long time, we'd been saying, look, it's not actually about the minutes on the clock. It's about what you're doing. Are you engaging in interactive, what we could call serve and return type interactions? Are you learning? Are you creating some of your own content and sharing it? Are you spending time with friends and building relationships or family? Or are you actually relaxing and like lying back and, just like watching something that you really enjoy, either together or separately? And I think actually one slight hope that I have coming out of COVID is that actually that understanding of the deep range of activities, and how each activity brings something different, or may present different kinds of downsides, hopefully will be one thing that all parents can kind of take away from this period.
That's great. And Sonia, in the book, there's lots of conversation and many just wonderful examples about how parents are trying to instill values in their children, both around the use of digital technology, but also, more broadly. Can you tell us about how parents were successful, or maybe not so successful sometimes, at instilling values? And I'd love to, if you can, just share some of the great examples from the book.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think we kind of expected to find lots of anxiety and questions. We definitely heard a lot of questions from parents, and the anxieties are real. But we came away, in a sense, kind of intrigued about the parents who kind of were figuring out how to be positive, and some managed and some don't. So, but we always had in mind this idea that we developed that. When parents are talking about technology, they're both talking about technology and they're also talking about their lives, their families. So, we kind of came to think of digital technologies like the terrain where we negotiate who we really are. And I mean, one example is a couple who come from different countries, and they were trying to work out how to live in London, from their different cultures, and how to bring up their 6-year-old son. Actually, we opened the book with this family because it was kind of emblematic that the mum found the technology really exciting and the dad was really worried. And so they were arguing, should we allow it? Should we restrict it? And they were, those are real questions, but they were also saying, how do we want to live in this new city and this new life? Do we want to embrace the new and be open to new possibilities? Or do we want to kind of be cautious? And how do we want to prepare our son, for a digital future? So, lots of those conversations kind of operated on that double level. And the families that seemed kind of most calm, really, were those who we thought kind of worked out what their values were for their lives and then fitted the technology into that. And that made for a lot of diversity. People are using technology in really different ways. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for us as well. So, one example was a couple on a really low income with a kind of very kind of arty lifestyle, and their small flat was crowded with craft projects and photography materials, and they took that kind of interest in art and crafts to how they helped their sons find computer games. So the mum loved Monument Valley because it was a game that kind of carries forward Escher's aesthetic, his art. So the kids of course the boys played commercial games with their friends, but they also played some of these more arty crafty games that they're kind of fit with their family's values. And then a kind of really different case, and we had a number of kind of migrant parents living on really low incomes, and they had a whole series of problems to contend with. And often they would, one family I'm thinking of really kind of hope that education is going to be the solution for her children, and that technology is going to be the means of delivering education. So, for her and other families, investing in education was a really expensive and demanding thing, and the technology would break and the kids would be needed to fix it because, the parents didn't already know how. Always. But in this particular family, even though she couldn't really use the technology, the mum loved sharing music from her home culture, which was Ethiopia, to play music to her daughters so that she could kind of bring something from her culture, and they would find this kind of life together. And then, maybe if I can just squeeze in one more example, one parent who was she was just such a geek, and she loved all things technology, and she had wired up the home with multiple computers because she said The digital future is so exciting. Geeks will inherit the earth. The jobs for the future are going to be with technology. She was one of those. Several parents told us that coding is the new Latin. Coding is the thing we need to get our kids to do. And so her sons would invite their friends around, and she would set the Minecraft challenges, and they would kind of play Minecraft together, and she would keep an ear out, and every now and again she'd throw in a new challenge. And so very different families and very different struggles that they're facing, and ways of embracing the technology as part of the solution, but finding a solution with the technology, and one that they could kind of share with their child in a way that built a conversation about technology and about their values.
I love that. That's great. Great examples. And the kind of diversity of the ways that families are trying to incorporate technology in ways that, like you said, support their values is really astonishing. And just, again, kind of show you that no two families are alike. And so we shouldn't expect that there's kind of one way of doing it correctly, because there's just so many different pathways to kind of supporting your children and supporting your values. Alicia, so in the book, you talk a little bit about how many parents are adopting what we might consider to be kind of more democratic styles of parenting. In other words, really trying to involve their children in decisions, trying to promote independence, trying to promote family belonging. But that kind of democratic style of trying to involve kids in those decisions seems to break down around the use of digital technology. Why is that? And what do you think parents should do about it?
I think it's really interesting. One of the things we were trying to do in the book was invite parents to look back at their own childhoods and then try to look forward to what they imagined their child's, adulthood to look like. And obviously it was a lot easier for people to talk about their own pasts. Some parents really looked back very nostalgically at their own childhoods and really contrasted it to what they saw as their child's kind of current present. And really nothing marked the difference so much for many parents as the sort of absence then and presence now of all these different kind of forms of technology. Some families really looked back with a lot of kind of regret or like concern about the way that they were raised, feeling that their own parents had really not listened to them, or that they had not had a lot of kind of choice and opportunity that they saw their children now having. Actually thinking particularly of a family of two moms who really talked a lot about like how they saw, gender and opportunities around interest-driven learning, being so much more exciting and opportune for their child. And so a lot of families were really trying to find this way to live more democratically, to involve their children in decision making, which is, I think, consistent with a new kind of advice that Common Sense and others have been giving to really try to involve kids, because I think there's a lot of research that shows if kids aren't involved in decision making and rule setting, they're much more likely to try to circumvent those rules. And we definitely had a lot of families where the parents had put in place some kind of draconian rules and the kids were definitely finding their clever ways around them. But what is interesting, and I think you raised, Mike, is that we had a lot of families where the parent would spend a lot of the interview talking about the value that digital technology had brought to their own lives, but they sort of struggled to figure out how to translate that to their children. So, for example, we ended up interviewing a number of kind of parent bloggers and, sort of what, could be called, I guess, parent influencers. And just thinking of one, mother who had a pretty successful blog. She had a pretty big following. She'd had a couple posts that had gone viral and was sort of, she had been able to leave her kind of, more inflexible job to be able to pursue this career. And that she was talking in a lot of the interview, she would talk about the benefits that had brought her, how she'd taught herself, HTML, that she'd learned all these different new digital skills that, allowed her to optimize her social media and her blog, and, that her photography had improved, that she was able to spend, more time with her children because she, didn't have to have her more inflexible schedule. And then when we turned to what she was doing with her children, she basically said that she had told her 5-year-old that the iPad was broken, even though it wasn't, because she didn't really want to deal with, like having to figure out how to police them. So she would just periodically say that it was broken. And when we talked about like why she was so resistant to digital media for her kids, it was really notable that she didn't really draw on any of her own pleasures or experiences that she'd had. She didn't talk about how she'd learned all these great new skills, how she'd formed this community. And I did leave a lot of those interviews thinking, gosh, these are parents that really could help guide their kids towards these really creative activities or help them deal with some of the actually emotional difficulties. So for example, some of the bloggers talked a lot about how hard they found it when somebody else seemed to be like having a great life or like really successful, and they, felt badly about themselves. And that's actually such a real experience, obviously, for many young people, particularly tweens and teens who are like just getting started with social media and understanding like, what it feels like to feel left out, what it feels like to feel like people are presenting a certain face. And so I really was struck by those parents sort of didn't find their way to using their own experience as a resource for their child, and like didn't talk about how they themselves had dealt with those feelings, or how they had learned either actual kind of technical skills or coping skills. And so I really was left a lot of those interviews feeling like, gosh, it would be great if parents could see themselves more as a resource for their children as they're kind of starting these journeys, and really kind of provide that mentoring and discussion that they do in other kinds of parts of life that often in digital technology, it's more like shut it down as opposed to have those kinds of conversations.
That's interesting. And in the book, you talk a little bit about the kind of many sources that parents go to in order to try to find guidance. And not even recognizing that they themselves can be a source of guidance is really striking. But one of the places where you mentioned that parents frequently go, either because they're getting instruction from or they've sought it out, is from educators. And Sonia, especially now in this current climate, what can parents and educators learn from each other? How can they engage with each other? And specifically, I think there's a lot that can be learned from people who have been using technology for a lot longer than some of us have, especially for educational purposes. And I'm speaking specifically about special educators. So what do you think about this relationship, and what can we learn from each other?
Yeah, so I think we would hope, and we did hope, that there would be a kind of good conversation between parents and teachers, parents and educators, because they're the two key kind of partners in bringing up children and kind of optimizing their future. But we did ask everyone about this idea of how do you prepare a child for the future, and we have to acknowledge it's a pretty impossible task, So when we ask parents or educators, how do you imagine the year 2030 or 2040 when the children will be grown up? What will they be facing? No one can really answer that question. And what comes to mind is technology as a kind of science fiction vision. So it was around the technology that we looked for a kind of understanding and conversation between parents and teachers. And I'm aware there'll be both parents and educators on the call. And I think, there was a lot of misunderstanding. And I appreciate, that both sides are kind of trying really hard, but each tended in a way to have a kind of concern about the other. So parents were often very puzzled about what happens to the children when they're learning about actually anything, but we asked about technology at school. And teachers don't, it seems to us, give a lot of thought to what goes on in the home. But, we were very kind of exercised by this idea that the child comes from the home to the educational setting. Not now, I appreciate, but, when we were doing the work. And parents are trying to prepare their children for what they're going to learn. And then when they get home, they're trying to kind of follow up on what the children might have learned. And it's just hard to understand. And, this is, again, an area where technology could help because, a lot of educational settings are building intranets or email services or messaging services to communicate with parents, but they were often one way, and they were often used for kind of disciplinary reasons, to kind of say what had gone wrong with the child today. But they didn't open up a lot of conversation, and they didn't build a lot of understanding. And I think especially for learning that is new to the parents, like anything to do with technology, but coding is a great example. Parents kind of know that coding is important, and they're putting their kids in coding clubs when they can, or delighted when technology is used in the classroom. But we had a lot of confusion about what the children are learning, and a lot of uncertainty about how they could better support their child. And we heard it similarly, that the teachers would do what they could in the classroom, but then they knew the kids are going home to often better technology or different technology, and they don't know, they kind of don't know how it gets used. So, and even some very practical things like the technology that might get used in the classroom isn't available at home, so the child can't show the parent what they've learned, and the parent can't contribute or ask questions because the tech can't, and the other way around. The child might be doing something on the computer at home and the school uses different technology, and it can't be, so there were just so many misunderstandings that we would love to, see better ways of building and understanding. But, thinking about some of the families we interviewed where their children had special educational needs, which we really wanted to include, for partly because they're often forgotten about, but also because often those are the families where they hope the technology will provide a kind of workaround, a kind of a solution. And parents told us about a kind of, they imagine a kind of special affinity often between the way their child perhaps with autism or with learning difficulties, how they might learn. And there we found some really wonderful special educators who were kind of putting in more time, I guess, than educators often have to really tailoring the technology or building the resources or kind of trying to develop that partnership with the parent. So that was one of the kind of inspiring areas. And I know both parents and educators are incredibly hard pressed. So it's not a criticism, but a kind of a call to hope that there can be more chance for more of a partnership approach.
Absolutely. I mean, I hope we continue to see, again, given the current age that we live in and the fact that we're going to be much more reliant on the use of digital technology, and parents are probably going to have to come more up to speed with what their kids are doing in the classroom, and kids are going to be much more invested in it, that we can start to draw some really important lessons about how they engage each other and come to a better understanding of what's going on in each other's environments. Alicia, one last question for you before we kind of move over to talk about some of the audience questions that we have. But what did you learn from speaking with families from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And what can families from different backgrounds learn from each other?
So there's some pretty famous kind of sociology of the family kind of canonical works that we actually ended up reacting to and not actually finding a ton of support for in this book. And so one is the work of Annette Leroux, who sort of traditionally had talked about kind of higher income families who what she describes as concerted cultivation. So they're kind of like, signing their kids up for a lot of clubs. They're doing a lot of different kinds of support. And she contrasts that with what she describes as natural growth amongst lower income families. And that's partly like not having the resources for all those classes and clubs, but also the kind of belief that children will, can kind of be growing and sort of learning on their own and don't need as much kind of parental intervention and support. Again, partly that's about time and financial resources, but also there's some kind of belief to that. And I think we did actually not find a ton of support for that in the families that we talked to, in the sense that when I talked earlier about embrace, balance, and resist, like we found families across the whole income spectrum doing all of those things. And so, for example, we contrasted in the book between two families, both of whom had boys who they had signed up for code clubs, right? There's a 10-year-old and a 8-year-old, one in a very, very high income family, one in a very, very low income family. And so in some sense, both parents had really embraced the idea that technology would offer something unique to their sons. Both sons were, real tech enthusiasts, but the resources that they had available, both in terms of the kind of cultural capital and the understanding that the parents had of like how to navigate the different environments, in terms of how to like confer what the kid was learning in the class into some kind of like longer term career prospects. But even just at the basic tech, in the low income family, the mother, he was going to a free after school Scratch club at his low income primary school. The school did not have a lot of resources for this, so the students had to sort of cycle out every term to make room for the next cohort. The mom had bought a kind of a supermarket brand tablet that, actually when we visited, I was sort of sitting in this kind of small living room. There were 3 kids and a single mom, and there were probably like 10 different digital devices in the room, but like 7 of which were broken or sort of like low functioning because, they'd been inherited or they'd been bought at low cost. So in some sense, she was using like a huge disproportionate amount of her income. She was a supermarket cashier. And so she was using a huge amount of her income to really invest in these digital technologies, but they weren't kind of serving her kids in the same way. Whereas at the sort of high income family, he was going to this like pretty expensive summer camp where he was learning Python and learning all this kind of professional sort of skills and behaviors from these camp counselors who were also, computer science undergraduates, et cetera. So in the sense, like both families had a very similar kind of belief system about what they were doing, but the advantage that was going to come out of that was hugely different. And so I think like one thing to kind of note there, I guess, is for each of those families to understand that the other is equally trying. I think sometimes we can have this narrative where we, if we don't sort of see the efforts that other families are making, that we sort of assume that they're not doing anything. And there was a lot of kind of behind closed door. But I think, again, in the case of the low income family, the mom had very little contact with the school. She never really had the kind of time or ability to like sit down with the teachers and say, look, he has these interests, how can I support them? And so in some sense, her hopes were very invisible to the other people that were in her son's life. And so in some sense, it's kind of consistent with a long-term kind of replication of certain kinds of advantage, which is that, likely both of those kids, they may pursue those interests, but I think where they will end up with those interests is likely to be very different.
I mean, that's such a good point too, and helps you, I think, helps parents, I hope, empathize. Parents are just trying to do the right thing for their children, and they have different means to get there. But obviously, all parents are just trying to do the best that they can. So let's switch it up and get to some questions from viewers. I know we've had a very active chat session going on. This question is from Davina. Which parenting style is recommended? It does seem like embrace and balance could be preferred. And Davina is a PhD student writing in from India.
Well, we didn't want to make that choice, and we don't in the book, because as we really try to argue, parents have different reasons for choosing the different styles of parenting at different points in their lives or in the day, or sometimes for different children. So it was in a way we really wanted to listen to what their reasons were. But I guess we also came away feeling that both the embrace and the resistance strategy are in a way risky. And risky, I mean, in the sense of planning towards the child's long-term, kind of digital future, because we don't really know if, to go back to the case of my kind of super geeky mum, is Minecraft the way? Is Scratch the way for the kids learning coding? Will something completely different be really what would have mattered more in 10 or 20 years? So putting a lot of emphasis on one strategy in a way really brings up lots of uncertainties, and we felt that the parents kind of felt that. And similarly for those who were resisting, often sometimes out of anxiety and sometimes out of a really kind of strong preference for values that they felt were getting lost, but still, you know, it's not being part of the kind of general flow perhaps is a risky. So people finding what was kind of worked best for them more or less. And in a way, we really want to say society needs to kind of support these different strategies better so that parents aren't on their own making these risky decisions. And maybe kind of a key point also is, as Alicia just said, to kind of respect the differences among the families, not in terms of inequalities, but the different choices parents are making, and not feel everyone's got to find the right way. Everyone's got to find the one right solution, because I don't think that exists.
No, and it's so hard as a parent to know if you're making the right choice or not. It's an impossible task, and we're all just trying to do the best we can. Okay, let's take another question. From Dorby Williams, this is a great conversation. Can you reflect on any differences you found between US and British parents?
I will take that as a dual UK-US citizen, but also obviously the bulk of the book was based on interviews and survey with British parents, but we did actually do a subsequent study on a related topic in the US and the Bay Area. And also we did some kind of comparative coding with a few other colleagues who had been doing research with US parents. I have some personal reflections on this also as the parent of 7-year-olds born in London, now living in the Bay Area. And I think a couple things of note. I mean, first of all, there's many similarities actually in terms of the kind of anxieties that parents feel, in terms of the opportunities that they saw. So actually probably many more commonalities than differences. And again, perhaps those commonalities were more along kind of class lines. So parents with greater resources in both places will be doing more similar kinds of behavior. And just to point out a couple interesting differences, and Sonia also has done a lot of good comparative global research on this as well. One is that, one thing that we noticed from a colleague who had done a lot of focus groups and interviews with US parents was that US parents were more likely to use kind of metaphors around like law enforcement and more likely to feel proprietary over the kids' devices than UK parents were a little bit more likely to kind of respect the kind of space and expression of the child. So, for example, our colleague Nathan Fisk, who did some interviews in Florida with parents of middle schoolers, noted that a lot of those parents would use terms like, if they give me probable cause to search their phone, I'm going to search it, and that is just not something that that's not a framing that we heard from UK parents at all, that kind of more police kind of framing. And there was I think there was a little bit more of an interest in the UK in that kind of, in the privacy of the child, kind of respecting that it was their space, whereas the US parents sometimes would say things more like, I bought the phone, so it's mine, I pay for the contract, so it's mine, that kind of thing. I think there's an interesting argument to be had for like what works, and to an extent, if you position yourself as a police, then what are you positioning your child as? Are they the criminal? And then, in what sense does that kind of, in some sense, create more conflict between parents and children? But again, there's a lot that was very similar between the two countries as well.
That is so interesting, and I will definitely think about that in terms of my own parenting practices. Okay, we have time for one last question from Chelsea Fields. Do you have any tools or methods to help children reflect on their own technology experiences? Ooh, that's interesting. Okay. For Sonia or Alicia?
That's such a nice question. And in a way, I do a lot of research with children and have tried many different strategies over the years, but I guess one that works well, so it always works well having children in a kind of a group where they have different experiences, and just hearing the different experiences makes it obvious to them, if it wasn't, which it often wasn't before, that they are also all different and living under different circumstances and have different understandings. But it's often good to ask a child what do they think is the right way to approach a younger child and what will be good for the younger child, and then the older one kind of becomes more responsible and thinks, you know, a bit differently. But getting siblings together can often bring out, I don't know what Alicia would say with hers, but it often kind of brings out the honesty in children. You know, if they're reflecting just the child and the adult, then they might say what they expect, you know, what you expect to hear. But if there's few of them together, maybe with their friends, and they start having conversation, they hold each other a bit more to account, and you get a bit closer to I think what they're really up to sometimes, and what they really think.
I love that, and I love the idea of having your older sibling, if you have an older sibling, help to think about what you would advise to the younger sibling or younger child. But that's great. Alicia, any last words from you?
I'm a parent of twins, so I think in a way I get the different version of that, which is the sort of policing each other version. But I think it's a good point. I think also what often works, I think, as well is playing something together and actually using, you know, that kind of co-use and really kind of sitting down and actually not sort of like interviewing your child, or, you know, sometimes we advise around family media contracts or things that are kind of like outside of the experience. But there's a lot to be said of just like having the experience together and then kind of talking and reflecting on it, both during and after. And so certainly encourage parents to, like, you know, play together with your kids and spend that time together.
All right, that is a wonderful final thought to end up on. Our time is up. So we'd really like to thank both Sonia Livingstone and Alicia Blum-Ross, as well as the LSE Department of Media and Communications and University of California Irvine's Connected Learning Alliance, for mental health resources for kids of all ages as well. You can take a look also at our Common Sense's latest report, Tweens, Teens, Tech, and Mental Health, which you can find at commonsense.org. If you'd like to share this session with other parents and caregivers, you can find it on Common Sense's website, as well as their YouTube channel. And to make sure you don't miss future live conversations, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Please do go out and check out this book. It really, really is a wonderful, super interesting read. You won't regret it. Thank you all so much for joining us. Bye-bye. Have a great day.